Welcome, Mama Youth Mene, everybody. Benny Cosmic, your subconscious here, with another episode of Decolonize Daily, where it's our goal to reprogram our collective consciousness through the process of learning about ways of life outside of colonial and capitalistic viewpoints. This time around, first things first, yes, I'm a male, so if I need correction, women, please correct me. As for the men, thanks for being here. I'm doing this because we don't need to change the message. Sometimes you just need a different messenger for the message to stick. So, stick with me and let's get to it. If you watched my previous videos, thank you. More importantly, you have an understanding of semiotics. And if not, check it out. Brief talking points it's the study of how reality gives meaning to itself by the use of symbols, indexes, and icons. So we'll be applying that lens along with an indigenous perspective, obviously. Quick vocab lesson to keep up as well. Matriarchy is a societal structure where the women are in charge of decisions such as who gets born, the spiritual rituals, what the society does, and where its values are derived from. Furthermore, I'll be providing historical evidence along with historical context and spiritual practices that we can either glean or adopt to our day-to-day lives, just to give you more of an insight of how these societies actually ran. So yeah, let's get. Historical evidence shows a timeline of matriarchies that are still around today and from the past. Let's also keep in mind that most historians were males, so examples of thriving matriarchies were probably omitted from the books to make it seem that patriarchy has only been the way to do it, right? Outside of Turtle Island, we have a couple different examples. So one of them being Neolithic Europe, which was essentially an egalitarian society with a dash of matrilineal. And what I mean by that is men and women's roles were equal. Egalitarian means equal roles. There was no separation of the sexes. And matrilineal just means that the last names and legacy were passed down through the mother's last name, right? And this occurred anywhere from 7,000 to 1,500 BCE, which was before the Common Era. Continuing our timeline, we also have the Minoans from Greece, which essentially occurred from 2,700 to about 1450 BCE, and it's theorized that their whole society stemmed from the worship of women and following them. Anything from their art, their literature, and their mythos, even their creation gods were feminine. Fun fact about this place is the Minoans actually have the creation story where Crete is where Zeus was born, and just kind of tying into semiotics a little bit and the idea of symbolism is I believe that the timing of Zeus being born was a signaling or symbolization of patriarchy taking over that culture. And what I mean by that is because in a lot of that society's mythos and Greek mythology, there's a lot of stories where Zeus commits, SA, right? Assault of that nature. And it's deemed as okay because he's a god and he creates demigods, half men, half god, right? So what that would symbolize on a cultural level, because how do you get a whole populace to be tricked into believing that it's okay to be like that? You create stories where the things you idolize make the same mistakes as weak men, so that weak men think that it's gonna be okay, right? So continuing that train of thought, we also had the Egyptians, ancient Egyptians, who actually liked being called the Kemetans, the people of Kemet. Keep that in mind. And they always had an egalitarian society. It didn't matter what your gender was when you became ruler, as long as you were the ruler, it didn't matter, right? But their most successful pharaoh was a feminine pharaoh, and their name was Hatshepsut. And their most popular female pharaoh was Cleopatra, which I'm sure you've heard Frank Ocean sing about. Moving closer to modern times, there's also the Musul of China, which to this day still thrive in the Yunnan province. And in this society, women are the heads of the household and inherit property along with making any business decisions in the household or regarding family finances, though they were truly matriarchal out there. And fun fact, China actually has the highest amount of female millionaires with an M and billionaires with a B. But maybe they're not correlated. They also practice animism in a heavy regard, which is another correlation you'll see through a lot of these societies. Jumping over to Costa Rica, we also have the Bribri tribe, who similarly follow matrilineal practices for land stewardship, specifically, like who's in charge of keeping the land healthy. That's how we viewed it in that society. Land stewardship is different than land ownership, and it's really just a perspective. Then, of course, we had the people in Ghana who went by the Akan people, A-K-A-N, and they still have queen mothers to this day, and it's still very much a real practice. And then in Kenya, we have the Umuya people, which is actually a woman-only village, which was founded as a safe haven for survivors of sexual assault and things of that regard, where every aspect of the society is ran by women. They do not allow men in that village whatsoever, rightfully so. That's another one. Now, we're back to Turtle Island, where a majority of the people here were egalitarian and matrilineal, probably because we understood it worked. But the most notable were the Iroquois Confederacy, which again, these are all examples of thriving societies that are still around, even though they tried to erase us, we're still here. And I think this should give you an example that matriarchies did work, even though a lot of people try to feed you otherwise. With history out of the way, let's talk biology. In animal kingdoms where societal implications have no bearing, here's a list of creatures that practice matriarchy naturally. There's African elephants, lions, honeybees, orcas, spotted hyenas, meerkats, lemurs, prairie dogs, and ants, along with the naked mole rats, to name a few. But the most closely related to humans are the bonobos. Their common trait is that females gather together to protect themselves and their young, and in their framework of how they socialize, they only have males for reproduction, and even then, most of the time, males don't even bother the women, because like if they did, then the women would gang together and just beat them up. Look up bonobos. It's a fun fact. Okay, Benny, we get it, but how does any of this apply to decolonization? Well, I've come to learn is that before you can fix something, you have to be able to know how to take it apart and what's actually holding it together, right? So following that train of thought, let's look at what caused the shift. I think it started when men who weren't the best candidates for survival were no longer being chosen by the women who were in charge of who got born in those societies. And those weak men had to resolve to sexual assault. I can't put it any other way. And that's why in a lot of the cultures back in the day, and even now in our culture, you know, the people who stand by it see that as an unforgivable and dishonorable means to do anything, right? It was grounds for death, rightfully so. So, when the root of a tree is rotten, it can only give out sickness. And moving that through line along, when you have a culture that is rooted in conquest, and that's all it does, and it moves out of ignorance willingly, and is willingly blinded to the consequences of their actions, you could see how it would seep into other cultures by default or through very violent conquest. So, another fun fact. The Romans would perform ritual sacrifices after conquering a people, and they would perform said rituals on the holy sites of whoever they conquered, right? More notably is Judea. When they conquered Judea, the siege of Judea, they went ahead and went to the temple after subduing everyone. And while they were tearing down that temple, they brought oxen, livestock, and other sacrificial creatures, which they had to bring during the war, crazy to think about, to sacrifice in the name of their deity, Zeus, or Jupiter at this point in time, right? Because they adopted that stuff from the Greeks through their conquest. And in essence, it would kill that god and the spirit of that people, right? And that is a very real and physical example of spiritual warfare, if I've ever heard one, right? So, why did I mention Judea? Judea, another unfun fact I'll say, is where Jesus Christ was crucified by the same Romans, right? When you want to kill the spirit of a people, you kill their God. And what was that guy doing? He showed up to Judea and saw his people who were supposed to be living in accordance with harmony of the world, I'll say, the voice of all things. And he started speaking out. He was flipping tables. Why are you setting up money making objects in a place of purity, right? He was out lashing against the Romans and the way they did things. They were the original colonizers, right? He was against it. What did they do? They crucified him in front of all of his people. They made a ritual sacrifice, spiritual warfare. And then, even worse, is after they did that, they convinced the rest of the world that they loved him and started calling themselves the Roman Catholic Church. So, he starts to see the branches of this rotten tree that is patriarchy, right? Unfortunately, it continues into the conquering of other societies, big and small, through Europe, Neolithic Europe we talked about earlier. It was taking out their druids, tribesmen, their priestesses, their high priestesses, the goddesses, and enacting spiritual warfare through the physical, right? And in all of those areas, they were egalitarian and matrilineal, so they weren't even prepped for in the sense that they were looking for it, right? A lot of these people evolved, I will say, past the need for worrying about other humans, or never even developed the need for that, right? Whereas the colonizers, the original colonizers, the Romans, always won by attacking these people that weren't looking for war to begin with. It's crazy how we're then fed this fallacy that it's the superior way to do things, even though it only seems that way because they always ambush people. So, tying back into, of course, the spiritual aspects being subdued, Western civilization would adopt symbols from the conquered cultures to get their people who have just been conquered to assimilate more easily, but also to bastardize those symbols and essentially give them a simulacra, a copy of something that has no original. And with this false connection to source, God, the universe, whatever you want to call that, you start to believe that you're separate from it, right? These ideas of nationalism and things of that regard start forming this sense of disconnection from the source, that you are by yourself. And that's where I think is the real issue of patriarchy and where those roots run deep. So jumping to physics and quantum physics, which says what all of our indigenous and matrilineal societies already knew, is that it's all relative, right? It's all relative. We have all of our relations. There's relativity there, which would make sense to make the correlation of why a colonial society would aim to implement divide and conquer tactics, right? Because there's so many levels to it. The division amongst the human race, I would say, started with men and women, right? The division of the sexes, the genders. And then from there, it went a level deeper of the division of skin tone, colorism, or worried about that. I'm brown, I'm red, I'm blue, whatever. Then it developed further division by implementing nationalism, a sense of culture, like I identify with this group of people. And okay, well, now we have people still coming together, so how do we fix that through a colonial lens? Well, we separate them further through class structures, ruling class, slightly less ruling class with privilege, usually rich people who think they're in charge, working class, usually us, the people watching this, And they would have servant classes, which is probably us if we're being real. And those structures divided people, even though they were together nationally, they were still divided through the class system. Okay? Now let's say people who are of the same class band together. Oh, we're still, we're middle class, we're working class, we're the people that get things done, right? Amongst that, what do you do whenever there's solidarity through a colonial lens? You divide and conquer. You divide those people by what? What else do they have now? Their ideas. You divide it by introducing the idea of intellectualism. And this divide and conquer tactic works on so many levels that it's hard to believe it's not spiritual in nature. And I will make one jump to the Hindi mythology, where the idea of this experience, what we're experiencing right now, was referred to as, I believe, the Maya, the illusion, where the oneness, the God, the Buddha, right, wanted to experience itself, so it tricked itself into thinking it was separate. And that's a whole other video I can get into, but that's all I'll say, is that the idea of colonialism is separating yourself from the oneness on the very deepest level. And I think the aspect of decolonization through matriarchal practices is getting more in tune with that oneness by realizing we are closer to that and each other than the fallacies we've been programmed to believe. Moving forward, what does it look like to counteract patriarchy? Well, we can start by listening to the women. We can start by questioning ourselves and what no longer serves us on an individual level. For example, if you're a guy who's chronically single, maybe instead of blaming the women you date, you do a little self-reflection. Dare I say it, therapy? Instead of coming up with excuses like male loneliness epidemic because the world is too woke now, be a real man by taking accountability for your ability to respond to the feminine within and without. And that means the feminine energy outside of yourself, women, right? It's your responsibility, your ability to respond to that is causing you that issue. Because let's be real, most issues men have with the idea of women ruling is just a projection based off of how men have been ruling things for centuries at this point. And fallacies like toxic femininity are really just men not realizing that women are embodying the masculinity they have in order to use it as a barrier to protect themselves from toxic men, which is kind of like a fight fire with fire situation. However, it's not working. It's just helping everything burn faster, which, if you're on the side of decolonization, still kind of works. For instance, patriarchy stemmed from men wanting to control others outside of themselves because they couldn't control themselves, going back to the idea of resulting in going after women and being predatory, right? So, in a society where your value is directly correlated to what you bring to the community, what happens when you can't hunt? Well, in most cases, you were given other duties or left on your own to figure it out, right? Which subsequently meant that most times that you weren't the lucky guy who was going to be able to have his genes carried on and have kids, right? And I say get to because in tribal societies, matriarchies specifically, the priorities were harmony and well-being for the collective. So women were selective of who had kids and when they did, because if there was too many mouths to feed, everybody would die. Or if there was too many matriarchs who were the wellspring of knowledge and wisdom, were stunted by having a literal human growing inside of them, that also wouldn't help their survival chances, especially if they needed extra nutrients to provide for that human that's growing inside of them, right? So just thinking practically, that's why it worked. Now, aside out of the way, women, especially the matriarchs, would usually discover or invent items from observation of animals and plant life using semiotics to improve the quality of life for the collective, for everyone involved. And some basic examples I can think of off the top of my head are baskets and weaving in general, maybe from watching spiders, right? The idea of if you're gonna bring us all this food, we need something to carry it with. Or we need to be able to weave the clothing that keeps us warm. We need to be able to construct teepees or some sort of housing, and that uses weaving techniques. So, quality of life, right? Or even agriculture, the idea that you're planting things and it's growing, and women had to be in charge of that, not because they're better in general, but because they literally have a calendar internally that syncs up to the lunar cycle so that they can figure out by feeling and intuition. Again, I'm not a woman, so I don't know how that feels, but the synchronicity, the correlation of your cycle being tied to the moon would also be a good time teller of how and when to do things for specific crops. What do you do when you have a society of men where they are not good enough to cut it to have their genes passed along, or they are committing dishonorable acts that gets them exiled from the tribe, right? What happens then? Well, those weak men or dishonorable men group together, and then they create an echo chamber of excuses of, why they're not good enough to justify their inadequacies instead of doing the work to be fully realized men. It's kind of like Reddit for incels today, or Congress. Now feels like a good time to highlight what healthy masculinity is. Being a good man isn't rooted in something outside of yourself, right? It's an internal set of questions that you have to ask and answer for yourself daily. And there's debates all over the world and throughout history of what those questions should be. But from my own experience, my questions are, am I living in a way that I could talk about it to people without feeling ashamed or holding back? Is the way that I'm living affecting or hurting others in any way? If so, how can I fix that? More importantly, why am I doing whatever it is I'm doing? What's my motivation? Right? Because when you take the time to ask those questions and answer them for yourselves, especially the motivation one, you realize what you're in control of immediately. And for all of us that feel lost and powerless, sometimes that's the first step, getting immediate control of your inner thoughts and asking yourself that question, right? So then the question is, when you answered those honestly for you, where does that take you? What are you supposed to do? Well, you realize that you don't need to be in control over others, right? That already gives you a better footing than the men that got us in this situation to begin with. And even if you find out that your motivation is strictly reproduction, like if you're a guy who just wants to have kids and keep that going and you're a simple fellow, all right, well, you work with that. You learn to find healthy ways to express that, healthy means of approaching it, and healthy means of being rejected for it. You gotta learn how to deal with all of it, buddy. Just saying. Because we have a right to our individual lives, how we live our lives, and how we want to feel this physical experience. But we do not have a right to creation. Right? And what I mean is that even if we are just here to eat fruit and be in the woods and reproduce, right? Like if we're here just to do the same thing that all the other animal kingdoms do, then that still doesn't entitle us to survival, right? Because survival of the fittest. And that sure as hell doesn't entitle us to reproduction. If you can't even survive, how are you going to reproduce? That's literally how evolution happens. So instead of viewing that as something you're entitled to, realize that just as much as your life is a gift, the privilege of creating or being a part of that process is not yours. It's not. So I think even then, the idea of people feeling entitled to a legacy is just another symptom of unchecked egos and fears that bred through our society into this amalgamation of different versions of patriarchy. But when we boil it down, it's all colonial mindsets, started from when weak men couldn't handle being weak men and stepping into their strength, and they had a perversion of what strength truly is and what the power really is. And if you have questions on what I mean, what the power really is, leave a comment. Maybe that'll be my next video. This has been Benny Cosmic, your subconscious, with Decolonize Daily. Thanks. I hope this helped. Peace.